Welcome everybody. So this is the second session of our 2024 annual program this year. Our overall conference subject is interlocutions. And the key idea with interlocutions, the 2024 NASR annual meeting will provide a space to explore contemporary theoretical gains that have a bearing on and/or implications for academic studies of religion. Most of our programming has to do with issues related to interdisciplinarity and bringing in the best of what's going on in other disciplines that we need to start thinking about and taking into account and taking into consideration. Robyn is going to help us move forward with introducing us to some things in aesthetics in particular, which I'm looking forward to hearing. As a reminder, NASR is a dues-driven organization, and as we'll talk about at our annual business meeting this year, our revenue has not caught up with our expenses each year, and so I want to remind everyone, if you haven't renewed, please do renew. If you renew at this point in the year, your renewal will go be credited for 2025, but we need the members to join so that we can continue bringing you the programming that we're bringing you. All right, so having said that, let me introduce Robyn Faith Walsh. She is an associate professor at the University of Miami. She studies early Christianity, ancient Judaism, Roman archaeology, and she, I think, will be speaking to the archaeology today in particular. Her talk today is called Cobbled Fictions, Lessons from Cultural History in Reception and Aesthetics. Robyn, go ahead.
Well, thank you very much. I'm significantly less nervous with so many friends, so I'm glad to have this lovely group here. I was saying to Craig before we started, I cannot believe you're letting me talk for like an hour, because I don't even want to hear myself for an hour. So wait, Rita's saying something. Are you agreeing with me, Rita? Not about the personal part, but like it's a lot. It's a it's a lot.
No, I'm totally looking forward to it.
Okay, well, yeah, I kept Googling. I was telling Craig, like, how many words is a 45-minute talk? Because I accidentally do 45-minute talks all the time, but I don't usually intend to. So I hope to make this as dynamic and interesting as I can. And I also tried to do something unusual for me, which is make it a bit wide-ranging, because we're all coming from different areas of the study of religion, and I want to try to make it as applicable as I can. So I will begin. And thank you, first of all, of course, to NASR for this generous invitation. I'm thrilled to be here, and I appreciate your time and engagement with this topic. So the central purpose of this presentation today is to reflect on assumptions we perpetuate in our scholarship. Given the wide range of scholars, again, associated with NASR, I decided to approach my remarks by drawing from the world of aesthetics and art history. As I noted in the abstract for this talk, cultural aesthetics intersect with our theoretical approaches to history telling, particularly in the museum and tourism industries, which package a highly romantic idea of the past, that for reasons of economy, cultural self-perception, even emotion and idealism, we have been reticent to challenge. I will also discuss the real-world implications for continuing to authorize an ancient Mediterranean imaginary steeped in the aesthetics of violence and colonialization. And to spoil the ending, one of the primary takeaways I want to propose today is that we tend to adopt ideologies, cultural, religious, and so forth, or select categories or objects that rationalize our choices. So I'm going to present this material in a combination of paper format, so reading what's in front of me, but also I'll do some extemporaneous talk as well. And I'm just going to call up, we just tested the PowerPoint. Let me make sure I can get this here. Oh, you know what? I have to open it first. That would help. There it is. Okay. Can you see it? Great. Okay, now let me move myself out of the way. Hold on a second. Hold on, I gotta stop share. It's got me in the center of the thing. I can't get rid of it. Okay, here we go. Good? All right. Hold on 1 second. Sorry, I gotta close it one more time. Is it working from your side? Yeah, it is. Okay, it's not from mine, so hold on 1 second. I don't know what's going on. Awkward. Got it. All right, I think what's gonna happen is I'm not gonna be able to see you. So I hope that's okay. All right, so I'll just go end it from here. All right, Craig, will you do me a favor and just talk to me if something's wrong?
Will do.
Okay, because I can't see anything but the screen of the
Okay.
power. Okay, thanks. Okay, so I'm going to begin today with a series of 3 case studies from the world of Roman imperial portraiture. In the uncanny valley that is Greek and Roman portraiture, little rivals the Barberini Togatus for eeriness. The mind's eye is forced to supply not 1 but 3 sets of painted sockets peering from these otherwise vacuous faces, each arguably more severe and stern than the next. And here, let me turn to this particular image so you can see it up close. That the Togate central figure is cradling 2 disembodied heads only adds to the aesthetic unease. The fixed herm at his right hand acts as a foil for the featherweight bust in his left. It must be made of clay or better wax to be held so effortlessly, suggesting both are so-called ancestor masks. Stylistically Republican, this effigy aggressively exemplifies any number of prized Roman aristocratic values, including things like agon and pietas. As such, it frequently holds pride of place in catalogs of late Republican or early imperial art, a keyhole for making grand claims about prestige, pretension, and nostalgia and Greek and Roman imagination. The only trouble is, this statue is a Frankenstein's monster. Elizabeth Marlowe refers to it as one of the tallest houses of cards in Roman art historiography. First attested in the collection of a certain Cardinal Francesco Barberini in the early 17th century, its inventory description generally corresponds with its present appearance, but neglects to provide any information about its find spot or acquisition. Thus, for our purposes, its narrative begins in the storehouses and hallways of the Barberinis, not in an assumed ancient tomb. The Barberinis, like many Baroque aristocratic families, were known to repurpose Roman spolia, creating amalgamated self-portraits emulating Roman emperors, senators, and so forth. Within 3 years of acquiring the Togatus, for instance, the family had taken the torso of an imperial loricate statue and crowned it with the head of their recently deceased patriarch, Carlo Barberini, in neoclassical style. The areas of Baroque and Romantic era fiddling are manifest throughout as well, most evidently the head of the central figure, which is indisputably a later addition. And I'm going to move to this slide because these different fractures you see are going to be important in a moment. Complicating matters are several fissures and discrepancies in the marble where the herm and freestanding bust are positioned, indicating extensive restoration or supplementation, not the mere stitchery of a technical join. All of this conspires to suggest an object less patrician and more pastiche. In other words, this statue is likely an invention of the early modern period, not an authentic artifact of the Roman world. And I'm going to show you this too, and we're going to come back to this. You see here that many of these statues are very much, especially the Togatus, they're missing their limbs. They're missing sometimes their legs, but more often their hands and their head. We have tons of these. This is going to come back at the end of my talk too, that this is usually the state of preservation we have for quote unquote authentic objects. So at the risk of belaboring the well-known, the fabrication of the Barberini Togatus is not exceptional. A disquieting number of our Greek and Roman antiquities are composite objects, mediated through both the literal and figurative curation of romantic interests. Museums are populated with presentations and descriptions asserting the original meaning, purpose, and significance of their holdings. What is often not disclosed is the degree to which these narratives are aspirational or strategic, how much of a statue is original or augmented, and whether or why authenticity matters, placing scholars in the position of inadvertently or uncritically reproducing what can amount to grand fictions. If you'll indulge me a bit more, I'll turn to the case of, it should be probably Marcia, but Marcia Furnilla, wife of Titus. I'm obsessed with this statue, by the way, but we'll get to that. Alternatively referred to as the, and I'm going to do a lot of quoting here, so I'll do the scare quotes, middle-aged Roman matron. Scholarly descriptions of this statue could rival any internet troll. I defy you to find a précis that does not lament her portrait head as neither young nor beautiful. Here, I'll give you a closer picture of her. Quote, deep lines crease her face from her nostrils to her cheeks. Quote, her aging, drawn face and fierce Flavian hairstyle juxtapose incongruously with her rounded and youthful form in the guise of the Capitoline Venus. Quote, an older woman, perhaps in her 30s, depicted when she most flourished in her role as a mother or even grandmother. End quote. In a brief piece for the Times Literary Supplement, Mary Beard remarks that in her youth, she used to be, quote unquote, very sniffy about Marcia Furnilla, MF, she calls her, but that after seeing her in person on loan at the Royal Academy from the Carlsberg Glyptotek in Copenhagen, she recognized that the sculptor was pushing away at the normative ideas of Greek beauty, surely asking about the relationship between age and desire. We have no attested find spot for this piece, only speculation. Indeed, we have no firm ground for identifying this as Marcia Furnilla. What we have is a broken statue, recomposed, with clear breakage at the neck, and a bust which may or may not belong with its torso. And we have retrospective scholarly bewilderment over the idea that a Roman sculpture could dare defy Greek standards of beauty. An idealized aesthetic understanding of statuary, culture, and art, inherited arguably not from the Greeks, but by way of 18th and 19th century European classicizing culture. Germany, for instance, embraced so-called material culture as a methodological challenge to the hegemony of philology. It was Eduard Gerhard, founder of the German Archaeological Institute and professor at Berlin, who avowed that, quote, all art historical knowledge must proceed from the masterpieces of Greek and Roman sculpture, end quote. And it was German Philhellenism and abandonment of enlightened Prometheanism for romantic aestheticism under men like Friedrich Schiller that established the Greek as the basis for more than aesthetic judgment. Ernst Corsius, also professor at Berlin at the would-be victor of Olympia, saw in Greek culture a universality comparable to that of Christianity and the role of the Germans. And their role was to reconcile and realize the two forces. More on these aspects of aesthetic judgment shortly. Finally, allow me to present perhaps a more familiar, but possibly even more ambiguous example. The so-called Fonseca bust, or bust of a Flavian woman from the Capitoline Museum in Rome. And if you've been to Rome and gone to the Capitoline Museum, she's up the stairs in a series of galleries that have imperial portraits and busts. So she's one of a number of them, but she's got kind of this pride of place in front of this window. And I think she's in the first gallery when you enter. So some of you may have seen her before. The portrait was bequeathed to a museum by a Franciscan friar, Jose Maria Ribeiro de Fonseca de Evora, in the 18th century. Fonseca, finding himself increasingly out of favor with Pope Benedict XIII, as well as the king of his native Portugal, presented this bust as a gift to the Holy See a month before his eventual ouster in 1740. According to the journals of the director of the museum, Fonseca considered the piece, quote, a souvenir of himself, una memoria de se, a testimony to his refinement and taste, with the self-dedicatory pedestal already inscribed. So he presented it like this, as you see it today, and that's actually extremely rare to see the pedestal already attached to the bust. In essence, it was the last grand gesture of a man on the outs with power, something to remember him by. As Marlowe describes it, The donation was an attempt to establish, quote, that his good deeds and benefactions outlived the memory of whatever misdeeds or misfortunes had triggered his recall to Portugal. In researching for this talk, I can report that this portrait is uncritically depicted everywhere. It is featured in discussions of imperial portraiture, as one might imagine, but also in studies of ancient forms of luxury, cosmetics, ideals of beauty, especially around Ovid, aristocratic frivolity, technologies of enslavement in terms of the labor it took to produce her so-called Flavian hairstyle. And I have another, that's not her on the right, that's her on the left. But I wanted to show you another example of the Flavian hairstyle, and I'm going to talk about this other bust in a moment. Technologies of marble working, i.e. the kind of drill required to make such elaborate ringlets in her hair. Debates over whether this is a portrait of Titus's daughter Julia, or per the art historian Paul Zanker, a later imperial woman in the House of Trajan. These debates continue to rage. And incidentally, if she's Trajanic, her hairstyle is about 30 years out of date. So people will debate, would a woman allow herself to be depicted with a hairstyle that's 30, 40 years out of fashion? So I think you could probably detect the misogyny. We've already seen some, but you can detect it in the way this particular piece is often discussed. But this is our third spin on the merry-go-round. So I imagine you can anticipate some of what I'm about to tell you. The portrait first blips on the historical radar in the mid-18th century, reputedly found as spolia inside of a late antique wall near the church of Saint Stefano Rotondo, a claim that perhaps has some merit given that this was a region known to have boasted a number of aristocratic Roman villas, but one that belies its relatively fine state of preservation. As you'll see, I'll show you more images of it. It's in pretty good condition. The tip of the nose and one ear has been repaired, but I understand these are different kinds of marble, but you can already see, compared to a similar kind of bust of a Flavian woman that you have on the right versus our Fonseca example on the left, for something that was used as construction material, it's looking pretty good. So that claim feels a little suspicious. Our friend Fonseca claimed to have purchased it from his neighbors, the Casale family, from whom there are records of spolia discovered in a late antique wall on the property in the 1930s. However, this bust is not recorded in that inventory. Indeed, at least two scholars have outright asserted that this bust was not found during those excavations and was not held by the Casales. So, curious. Another strike against it is those ringlets. So let me show those to you again. While piled in a style typical of Flavian fashion, they are far looser and more ornate than those made in typical portraits of that era via a short drill bit, which it produces more of a honeycomb effect. You actually just saw it with Marcia Fernilla. So you can see sometimes they're called snails, snail ringlets. So you can see what they're doing is they're just punching holes with a drill into the hair versus what you're seeing here, which are these ringlets cascading over her forehead. In fact, in all Roman imperial portraiture, there is only one other extant statue with the Flavian ringlets brushing the top of the forehead. It's actually an image of a priestess in Atlanta. It's not this one. This one I'm showing you again, the hairstyle, and I'll continue to look into whether I can find another example. In fact, the only other portrait that resembles Our Lady of the Hour, more hair, more Flavian hair, is here on the left, an alabaster copy, it seems. Maybe it's an imitation, a study, a model, prototype, some kind of copy that we know was purchased by a wealthy collector on the open market in the 19th or 20th century. Now, alabaster was not an ancient material that the Romans ever worked with, so good reason to suspect that this was an imitation of a more ancient original. So we know that the sister on the left, the alabaster sister, is modern, but we don't know the conditions under which it was created. The Fonseca's swan-like neck and delicate features are also somewhat unusual for the period she is presumed to represent. Without a secure find spot, we can only guess at her context. Is her neck turned to gaze admiringly at her spouse, her father, as one would expect in an imperial or familial dedicatory tableau? But her cocked head and soft gaze, perhaps even if we had context, also impresses rather peculiar, if not also unprecedented. And some people have described it as somewhat coquettish or flirtatious. To me, she kind of looks like she could be holding a phone. Now, here's where I get to speculate wildly. I would go so far as to say that her composition, her body position, her styling, while clearly in Flavian guise, impresses as far more Baroque than immediately post-Neronian. I have drawn from the 17th century Roman master Bernini and offering you some comparative examples. And to be clear, I'm not suggesting that Bernini is the author of the Fonseca object, but I draw from the pinnacle in order to illustrate the aesthetic standards of the period in which Fonseca reputedly made his status-seeking purchase and donation. In many ways, our Roman matron seems more at home with Bernini's portrait of his lover, Constanza Bonarelli, than Titus, Domitian, Trajan, or even Marcia. But I will tell you, unlike the other examples I've provided you with today, this portrait has some chance of being legitimate by a hair, or I should say, by an eyebrow. As many of you know from the excellent work of scholars like Sarah Bond on polychromatic sculpture, ancient Greek and Roman landscapes were not populated with lily-white portraits, reliefs, inscriptions, or turning elsewhere in the built environment, even large-scale structures. So I'll show you some images here, but all of our ancient Greek and Roman statues, marble statues, and structures were vividly painted. And so you can see here are some examples where some of the patina is still there. This is actually terracotta in the center, but I think perhaps the best example here you can really see is the red hair in the figure on the right. I also have a book here that I bought in Rome from the Vatican Museum that embraces and gives many examples of how their holdings would look colorized. I didn't scan all of those for today, but here are a couple of popular examples too that we see of some of the Roman imperial portraiture. And this is actually an Etruscan example, but the Etruscans have such influence on the Greeks and Romans that I think it's fine to use it. But it gives you an idea of, back to Uncanny Valley, how lifelike these things could be. So again, these structures, these objects, they were painted, vividly in fact. Even the examples we have where some of this paint remains is too faded and worn to capture how vibrant. I'm talking gilded gold bikini vibrant. So it's not just a matter of colorization, but detail. And without this original detail, certain elements can be missed, to say nothing in some cases of skin tone and symbolism. So I'm using many of my own research images in this presentation, but I did Google images to see if I could retrieve from public sources different angles on the Fonseca bust. And at one point I came across a fanciful rendering of the sculpture, not just colorized, but brought to life. So again, talk about Uncanny Valley. But this rendering is omitting an important detail. And so let me give you a close-up vision of her face, or image of her face. And this is where I wish I could see everybody. So I could see if there's recognition in your face. And I would make you work on it, especially if we were in a classroom, I would make you work on figuring out what the detail is in her face. I see somebody in the chat. Is it about me? Yes, Chris! Unibrow, you got it. I shouldn't get that excited about unibrow. It is the unibrow. If you look closely, our matron is sporting yet another Flavian fashion, the unibrow. Contouring was not en vogue for the Roman fashionista. And this is a detail omitted from her copycat twin that I showed you before, the Fizzoli bust. Somebody, whoever copied this, corrected the unibrow. Side note, somebody needs to do a history of eyebrows. Speaking of aesthetics, if somebody did a history of eyebrows, it would capture so much about culture and art, but I digress. So here, and perhaps only here, is where Fonseca conforms to aesthetic expectations. But whoever copied her in modernity preferred inaccuracy and modification over realism, or an offense against dominant taste. So let us propose, or presuppose for the moment, that Fonseca is indeed ancient. Her paint has faded, degraded, or has been scrubbed. she is now as alabaster as her alabaster imitator. That her modern copy is in alabaster is no accident. We elect to maintain collectively the fiction of whiteness and classical antiquity in our museums, media, books, textbooks, video games. This aesthetic is equated with reason, restraint, solemnity, and solemnity is from actually Friedrich Schlegel, notions theorized in the Baroque and Romantic eras, particularly as German thinkers and artists effort to link their peoples and culture with Greek and Indo-Greek Aryanism. There is much intellectual genealogy one can trace to establish how these connections were formed and justified, but I will briefly highlight the influence of J.J. Winckelmann, an 18th century figure. Winckelmann would come to greatly influence Romantic lions like Herder, Lessing, Schiller, Goethe, and Humboldt. Suzanne Marchand, in her wonderful book Down from Olympus, Archaeology and Philhellenism in Germany, 1750 to 1970, describes his influence and canonization as based in the social implications of his quote-unquote aesthetic predilections. His Greeks lived in a world without confining clothes or disfiguring diseases, where children were raised to be beautiful and nature revealed its beauties unabashedly. And his axiomatic praise for the noble simplicity and serene grandeur of the perfectly formed Greeks heralded a social revolution against the Baroque aristocratic tastes of the old regime under which he lived, which was associated with corruption, unearned wealth, and so forth. Winckelmann himself had been born a peasant and worked his way up in the ranks. He was a self-made man. Marchand notes, quote, Winckelmann's Greeks looked not unlike that generation's image of themselves, youthful, creative, self-sufficient, yearning for self-fulfillment, and passionate, end quote. There's much more to say about the systemic grip Greek and Roman culture asserted on aesthetic and intellectual culture in the 18th and 19th century and beyond. And this may not age well, but I'm aware, in addition to this being Tiberius's birthday, which I should know that, that's a little too much, Gladiator 2, Ridley Scott's Gladiator 2 is about to come out. There's also a prevailing trend on TikTok that I think is still fairly popular, talking about what your Roman Empire is. So whether it's those things or, you know, if this ends up getting published somewhere, something else will pop up. This has an enduring sort of evergreen quality, this hearkening back to ancient Rome. But I want to dwell for a moment on how entrenched this particular vision of the ancient Mediterranean has remained, arguably in part because of its malleability. For the budding mid-18th century appreciator, aesthetic love for the Greeks represented a subversion of dominant cultural forms, a rejection of aristocratic values. There's a certain irony in that. Today, as Pierre Bourdieu has painstakingly treated across various studies and lectures, high art and artistic appreciation or consumption, expressed in practices like museum going or purchasing antiquities at auction or on the trade market, are now a form of elite distinction, both cultural and economic. To be an art viewer is to define oneself in terms of a certain distance from the practical exigencies of life, to assert a privileged autonomy, what elsewhere Bourdieu associates with cultivating what he calls the pure gaze. But it is also, as Grenfell and Hardy described, an incarnation of social history. In a piece for The New Yorker titled The Myth of Whiteness in Classical Sculpture, Vincent Brickman rightly acknowledged that, quote, Westerners had been engaged in an act of collective blindness. It turns out that vision is highly subjective. You need to transform your eye into an objective tool in order to overcome this powerful imprint, a tendency to equate whiteness with beauty, taste, and classical ideas, and to see color as alien, sensual, and garish. Because scholars like Sarah Bond have already, end quote, because scholars like Sarah Bond have already written so compellingly about the essential and important implications of erasure and race in Greek and Roman archaeology, and I strongly encourage you to see her excellent work or to look up her excellent work, which will be heavily footnoted in this piece, allow me to shift focus back to where we began with this talk. Not only are we largely content with perpetuating a vision of reality mediated through 18th and 19th century aesthetics, we are also remarkably content with pastiche and forgery. The examples are legion. Among the museums willing to reveal the extent to which their holdings are, to the title of this talk, Cobbled Fictions, the degree to which the material inheritance of the ancient Mediterranean is comprised of little more than jaws-addled torsos can be startling. Heads, limbs, context added to conform with 18th and 19th century aesthetic expectations, again, when they're revealed, are basically leave you with very little. And the aesthetic appreciation becomes clear that it's very much a modern ideal, not one that we can confirm is ancient. So this is actually from the Palazzo Altemps in Rome, where they do reveal how much they have reconstructed in modernity the statues that they have in their holdings. So here's just one example. And remember, I told you at the beginning, remember those torsos that tend to be all we have remnants of. In this case, this is a typical kind of Aphrodite or Venus figure, very similar to Marcia Furnilla. And as you can see, all they had really was the torso. Everything from the knees down, everything from the shoulders down, and the head are all modern imaginings of what the statue may have looked like, but all that is original to it is that torso. Another example, the Arapakis, the Augustan altar to peace, which was once part of the emperor's elaborate funerary complex, was also the political pawn of Mussolini, who famously attempted to resurrect his vision of imperial Rome as propaganda for his regime. And you can see here, let the pickaxe speak is something he used to say. He is the one who searched for the Arapakis for his own, again, political purposes. There was only one problem once he found the Arapakis, though. The object was almost hopelessly fragmentary. So here he is. He created a whole museum to showcase it. It had its inauguration in 1939. There he is standing next to it. Here it is as it looks today. And you can see there are some areas in the upper register here. I don't know if you can see my cursor. You can see that they haven't tried to reconstruct certain aspects that are fragmentary. But this is one of my photos. I hope you can see in the very center here, that's actually plaster. That's not original to the Arapakis. And once you start noticing those fractures, you'll start to see that the lighter colored, it looks like stone here, but it actually is plaster, are copies that are, I mean, I don't want to use the word forgeries, but they are molds that were made to try to supplement what was missing from the Arapakis. So that was the solution. It's hopelessly fragmentary, the solution, plaster cast, to help reconstruct these voids. Perhaps relatively unobjectionable when applied to areas of the relief as you have here, where the structure is anticipated from extant pieces, but also it's part of a larger project. The Arapakis is another museum that has made strides in acknowledging that color, context, and original state are important for understanding this object. But to make this a holistic object, to make this one piece, to fill in those blanks and make it look like a structure again, was in pursuit of one of the more imposing testimonies to fascism in the 20th century. And there's quite a bit more to this story that we don't have time for today in terms of the remapping of the modern city of Rome for imperial purposes. You can see the Colosseum in the center here, but notice all the roadways work around the Colosseum. This was actually also Mussolini, who created his own imperial way, and the rotunda or the rotary. People have different terms for it depending on regionally where you live, but essentially a rotary around the Colosseum to really make it a centerpiece and showcase, again, of imperialism. Today, they're making a subway line around this area, so it's a little bit more cornered off, but this was the intention of Mussolini and the way he remapped Rome. Essentially, there's nothing about the built environment of Rome today that hasn't been affected by the political landscape of the 20th century. The way the entire city has been laid out, and here's the Forum Imperiale right here with the Colosseum down that imperial way. It has all been remapped in light of those fascist objectives. And more example, here's Mussolini marching down his imperial way. One more example that arose just this week. The plaster cast bodies from the ruins of Pompeii. Many of you may have heard of this. These were cavities within some of the volcanic stone that Pompeii started to be excavated in the 19th century. They would pour plaster into these cavities and they formed the molds of people whose remains had been in those spots and had obviously deteriorated. So since their discovery in the 17th, 18th century, much has been made of the obvious human tragedy and drama of the natural disaster of Pompeii. Much has also been made of how these bodies reaffirm ideals of motherhood, family, and so forth. So for one example, this one image from NPR, I got this image from an NPR article. There on the left, you can see that there is a body with a child, what's obviously a child being held on top of it. So this example, this particular grouping, featured an individual bedecked in gold jewelry and holding a toddler, and it was long heralded as a woman attempting to cradle her child protectively in her arms in their last moments. But again, just this week, DNA evidence reveals that this assumed mother was, in fact, an adult male, unrelated to the child. So the implications of this corrective narrative are obvious. So that it really does destroy the way that familial ties and ideals of motherhood had previously been reaffirmed. In a doorstop book on Monet, one can find Bourdieu's collected lectures from the College de France from 1998 to 2000. There he comments on what he terms the epistemological breaks and social breaks, and the role of the sociologist and the historian. This is a quote from Bourdieu that I find particularly instructive. Historians are in exactly the same boat as sociologists. The social world offers them ready-made objects. For instance, they receive lists of 17th century writers, which they will tabulate and calculate, but without asking how the lists were compiled. He puts it differently, and to my mind, humorously, later on in his analysis this way, quote, "A simple provisional definition of positivism would be to say that it is an exercise in excessive methodological rigor based on objects that have not been subjected to rigorous criticism." He suggests the following practical precept. We should be suspicious of everything that the social world offers up spontaneously, of everything that we find ready-made. Perhaps I'm simply catching up to the rest of you, but it has become nearly impossible for me to walk through the city of Rome or the Greco-Roman wing of a museum without the disquieting feeling that I'm being had. When I am on social media and I see an academic post a picture of their pristine office or perfectly organized lobes, when I've participated in the same kind of signaling, I worry again. Particularly in our current environment, in which the future of higher education, even now the future of the NEH, is possibly in doubt, do we fully understand what we are projecting? Are we subject to rigorous criticism? Are our attempts at academic distinction as mythic as the objects we so often uncritically accept? Recently, I have been taken by what I believe may be something of a lesser-known work of Eric Hobsbawm's, the transcript of his Walter Neurath lecture, Behind the Times, the Decline and Fall of the 20th Century Avant-Gardes. Near the conclusion of that lecture, he raises this observation, which is worth quoting at length. Quote, "In short, it is impossible to deny that the real revolution in the 20th century arts was achieved not by the avant-gardes of modernism," and this is the image that he shows along with this, "not achieved by the avant-gardes of modernism, but outside the range of the area formally recognized as art. It was achieved by the combined logic of technology and the mass market, that is to say, the democratization of aesthetic consumption, and chiefly, of course, by the cinema, child of photography, and the central art of the 20th century. Picasso's Guernica is incomparably more impressive as art, but speaking technically, Selznick's Gone with the Wind is a more revolutionary work. Advertisements and movies developed by hucksters, hacks, and technicians not only drenched everyday life in aesthetic experience, but converted the masses to daring innovations in visual perception, which left the revolutionaries of the easel far behind," end quote. I should add, by the way, that I know a little. I'm a fan of Francois Gillot, who was one of Picasso's, I guess, mistresses. I wish I could, partners. The one right before Dora Maar. Dora Maar painted a lot of Guernica, not Picasso. He would like go out for the day and he would tell her what to paint. So just a side note. I am now far over my skis as someone who is not an expert on Dadaism, the avant-garde, or modernism. But I include it as a part of our larger concern today with what the real revolution, back to that idea, must be in our field to modernize it for the 21st century. For our current politics as well. I leave that as an open question, but one, of course, that is at the heart of Nasser's mission. To my mind, and I have heavily hinted at it throughout this talk today, the influence of Romanticism in the field of religious studies continues to be the pall that prevents our revolution. This is something that I attempted to address in part in my book, The Origins of Early Christian Literature, although the central project of that study, and I'll talk about this again in a moment, was to challenge the degree to which we continue to treat the New Testament and the Gospels specifically as if they are communal objects, the remnants of a lost community of peoples or a nation. I identify German scholarship as an influence as strong mediators of this propensity in religious studies. So allow me to return to our understanding of myth, mediated through that prism, and why it appears that we continue to strive to preserve certain myths in our scholarship and understandings of history. Myth is admittedly somewhat of an amorphous term that signified an appreciation for aesthetics, literature, and art, practices and cosmologies of pre-modern societies. As a variety of German artists, academics, and writers sought cultural artifacts that might express the unique and essential spirit of their people or folk, the reclaiming of myths or the forging of new ones became common practice really from the Renaissance onward. Despite what I've indicated to this point, the vantage of political and from the vantage point of political science, I would be overstepping my bounds to comment on the soundness of theses that tied German use and abuse of myth to events of the 20th century. Certainly, there is something resonant about the romantic idea that the German folk were the long-deprived heirs of a storied history of a lost Germania. However, as Bruce Lincoln's formidable work on myth has demonstrated, the Germans were hardly alone in their pursuit of lost ancestors and mythic traditions upon which to build a nationalist fervor. James Macpherson's invention of a Gaelic translation of Ossian poetry stands as but one example of this seemingly ubiquitous European project. Setting aside the political implications of this observation, I detect twin issues with the way contemporary scholarship understands the roles that longing for myth have played in shaping the field of ancient and religious studies. The first is the specter of World War II. I hinted at this with Mussolini, obscuring myth's central role and how 18th and 19th century thinkers analyzed the ancient world. We may recognize that the Romantic search for lost folk or ancestors culminated in the unifying project of National Socialism, but we have been reticent to see its more benign influences in areas like classics and religious studies. Recognizing, for instance, Romanticism's consuming focus on communities and quote-unquote pre-literate storytelling helps to trouble our assumptions about the value of its model for describing how ancient literature was written, and thus creates space for us to reconsider the role of literate elites and their networks in the case of what I was doing in this book. I actually don't like having to look at my book, so I'm gonna move to this one, which will come up. But look at some ancient texts, that works too. Moreover, a greater understanding of the role of myth in the minds of those who founded the critical study of ancient texts, again, part and parcel of this is religious studies, crystallizes how, to paraphrase Hayden White, history is never disinterested. In the case of German scholarship, keen interest in ancient poetics, language, and ancestors often signaled a desire to construct a noble and authorizing history, particularly for Northern Europe, that broke the Mediterranean monopoly on antiquity. Second, historians who have documented Romanticism's influence on academic methods are often specialists in fields within which categories like myth or religion are, again, this being Nasser, under-theorized. As a result, terms designed to be categories of analysis can become conflated with their subjects of analysis. And I hear Russell McCutcheon in the back somewhere, like a little muse on my shoulder there. The key difficulty in identifying the role of myth in romantic thought is that it concerns three distinct applications: its inherited meaning and function and discourse from Greek mythos forward, the ways in which the term was employed and transformed over the course of the Romantic era, and the world we have inherited, which for many remains informed by Romantic thought. For the Greeks, mythos signified a story understood to be in some measure invented or false. Thucydides would use the word fabulous. Notably, however, the ancient writers who invoked the speciousness of myth often did so before proceeding to tell arguably fictitious stories of their own. So I'm thinking here of Plato, Hesiod, Herodotus, especially Herodotus. Much more to say about Herodotus, but this isn't the right group for that. The term was something of a rhetorical cudgel, a broadside to be used against one's competitors, but recognized to be an authoritative, if fantastic, form of storytelling when done with skill, as with poets. For German Romantics, mythos retained a sense of the fictive, but also denoted a set of persistent shared narratives, whether written or oral, and I would add visual to this, deemed central to the self-identification of a given group of people. In other words, a narrative with representative information about supernatural beings, cosmology, practices, landscapes, heroes, conflicts, laws, and so forth, all held by a folk. In the context of Romanticism's Protestant leanings, myth was increasingly associated with the peoples, culture, and literature that predated the perceived rise of Christianity. Despite Romanticism's rejection of Enlightenment rationalism, this tight correlation between myth and a pre-Christian stage of culture implied a certain theory of cultural evolution, including the conviction that myths were primarily an artifact of so-called pre-literate communities. That said, it did not follow that these pre-literate societies, sometimes called pagan, sometimes called primitive, were viewed disparagingly. As we have seen today, the Greeks were heralded for embodying ideal piety and beauty, for their love of nature. The Kinder- und Hausmärchen of the Grimm brothers brought to light the moral tales of a near-forgotten folk. And to the extent that they were considered products of pre-Christian or a pre-literate mindset, quote unquote, biblical writings represented the simple, unmediated, and divinely inspired expressions of the spirit, the Geist of the folk who preserved them. Colonialism would alter this affirmative perspective with terms like myth, again, primitive, illiterate, and barbarian, used malevolently to justify any number of ills and abuses. As with the Jews in antiquity, myth took on different valences depending on to whom or what it pertained. The Old Norse Eddas were proto-Jungian expressions of a noble collective unconscious. Anything else was as barren and dreary as the deserts they came from. In modernity, myth continues to carry many of the same ambiguities about truth value, seriousness, and nostalgia. Narratives labeled as myths can be embraced and celebrated for their creativity and connection to an imagined past. Alternatively, they can be dismissed as unscientific accounts of how things came to be. They can be associated with hallowed ancestors or shared social values, or they are seen as foolish rationalizations of those who knew or know no better. In any case, they function as a strategy to set off one kind of discourse from another, operating either to reject or to neutralize, reinforce, and advance socially constructed positions. In other words, they become ideology and narrative form. The difficulty with myth in contemporary usage is that it carries with it the implications of its past iterations as filtered through the discourses of the 19th and 20th centuries. Depending on context, the term can imply a Freudian collective anxiety or an Eliadian expression of the sacred, among other associations. Its flexibility indicates the degree to which it functions as an ordinary rhetorical device. A myth has no special qualities per se, but it obtains significance depending on how it is accepted and perpetuated by social groups with a vested interest in its continuation. Likewise, it is often the case that the further back such narratives can be traced, the more they are self-authorized by their continuity. So allow me to begin to land this plane. Oh my God, I've talked for so long, by offering a few more examples from religious studies and so-called material culture. And I hope at this point in the talk so far, you can start to see why I think we might need to abandon that term material culture. So this is something I'm still wrestling with, but I'm starting to think this needs to go in the wastebasket. So these examples address, as I suggested in the pitch for this keynote, the real world implications for continuing to authorize an ancient Mediterranean imaginary steeped in the aesthetics of antiquity, authenticity, as well as violence and colonialization. Now, there is terrific work from scholars like Brent Nongbree, Anne-Marie Lyondike, this is why this slide is up here, and Canada Moss on our manuscript traditions and New Testament and early Christian studies. The dating, acquisition, and authority given to what often amount to highly ambiguous and late, very late, extant manuscripts is a sobering wake-up call for many in my particular subfield. At this stage, no assertions about the cohesiveness of a text or the social conditions of its authorship, for example, this traditional claim that the canonical Gospels were anonymous, I think needs to totally be revisited or re-theorized. None of this should be taken for granted. A second example, early Christian art. When Jesus first appears in the frescoes and reliefs of ancient Rome, it is first as a traditionally clean-shaven Roman youth with a so-called magic wand, not a Judean peasant. He morphs into a cosmic king, and I think probably you can see up in the top here of this cubiculum an image of him bearded with the nimbus. This looks more traditionally how I think people imagine Jesus today. So he morphs into a cosmic king, and later a figure wielding alongside his illiterate apostles the symbols of imperial power, including the scroll. I'm particularly taken by this sarcophagus. This is also from the Vatican, where, I can understand why Paul is holding a scroll. I don't understand why any of these Galilean peasants are, but this is also very common in Roman imperial and allied portraiture at this time, to be holding the scroll as a symbol of your education, but also your power. And so they all are holding one in their hands as well. The magic wand that I mentioned, so this would-be magic wand, is actually depicted, and I have a piece coming out, I think in December or January, maybe January, in an art history journal on this. The so-called magic wand is actually depicted like the centurion switch, the switch meaning whip, of nostalgic imperial authority in the same exact period. So you have a Roman centurion here on the right holding his staff, which he uses to beat other Roman soldiers. And you can see how similar the body position, the hand gesture, the staff itself looks in Jesus's hand for performing his miracles. So the same authority that elsewhere otherwise celebrates the vanquishing of its subjects with depictions of prisoners and captives trampled to death. And here are a few more examples of, say, the Gauls being trampled and overtaken and colonized by the Romans. This is a very, very popular imperial image on a lot of sarcophagi for especially high-ranking Roman officials and members of the aristocracy. I just find it so bizarre. But the vanquishing of its subjects with depictions of prisoners and captives trampled to death, you can see how that, I actually have other slides here, but I'm going to hold off on those for a second. And I don't want to end on that one. So what's a good, that one's nice. You can see how there's some incongruity there. And certainly this last point has an entirely new resonance since I wrote it with the results of our last election and the realities of a Christian nationalism. At end, I hope, and actually here I can do this, so maybe I can actually see some people. There we go. Let me make this a full screen. So at end, I hope this wide-ranging talk has offered numerous touchstones for further thinking with our group, and my gratitude once again to Nasser for this honor and opportunity. Thank you very much.